Thank you very much. This is a really exciting evening for us, and we're just so pleased you could all be here. I have actually the honor of introducing to you the very first director, the founding director of the Paul Peck Humanities Institute. And she's going to talk to you a bit about a woman named Bella Myshkinski. And Bella is the person for whom tonight's lecture is in honor. It is a memorial lecture. It is our first annual, and we'll be having these in the future. I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Myrna Goldenberg, who started the Paul Peck Humanities Institute. She started the Women's Studies program here at the college. She opened the Women's Center here at the college. She was one of the early people starting the Center for Teaching and Learning, which is now called Elite here at the college. That's just when she was getting started. And so it is my honor to bring to you Dr. Myrna Goldenberg to talk about Bella Myshkinski.
Hello, hello. I'm going to start with Bella's whole name. Bella Berga Myshkinski Bermanis. What a woman. Many years ago, I introduced a course on the Holocaust at MC. 2 sections, 1 day, 1 evening. I thought it was well attended and going great, lots of student interest in both sections. I was at the bookstore one day to check on the inventory of the 9 or 10 books, I can't remember exactly, that I had ordered for the class. And a woman tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around. It was a petite, mature, I'll say. Her hair wasn't as gray as mine, but she's a mature woman that I recognized as a student in my day course. It was Bella, and her first words to me were, quote, "We're going to charge you rent." And I said, "Who is we and why?" So first the we. She said, "It was my husband Hank and me. He's in your evening course. He's a survivor, so am I. So we took your course to make sure you taught it right." And that's a quote. She said, he never talked about his experiences during the Holocaust, but when he comes home every Tuesday night after the class, he doesn't stop talking about it. You opened up a fountain. He keeps me up all Tuesday night and starts again when he comes home from work on Wednesday, and it spills over to Thursday and Friday and starts again on the following Tuesday. So you're in our house night and day all week, so we're going to charge you rent. That is quintessential Bella. And she continued, "As far as the course goes, we have no complaints. You're doing okay so far." Okay, she was very careful about that. And that was the beginning of my husband's and my beautiful friendship with 2 beautiful people who happened to be survivors of the concentration camps and all the brutality that characterizes the Nazi regime or Third Reich. What distinguishes them was their kindness towards others, their refusal to be defeated in spite of the horrors that they lived, and their lack of bitterness. One short anecdote about Bella that fills out her profile a bit, and then I will turn the podium over. But you have to know this. When Bella and her first husband and 2 friends were liberated by the GIs in Magdeburg, Germany, that's a wonderful, wild story, okay? The GIs took them to a deserted house. Many houses were deserted in the midst of Germany when the Allies were coming in. The people, they left. They left with the food on the table, you know, the food cooking on the stove. So the GIs brought them food that they had, used the word liberated, from another deserted house. Everyone was ready to eat, sit down and eat. They had been starved. Bella and her first husband had been part of the Holocaust, had been deported and so on. For over 5 years, they hadn't had what you would call even a tiny decent meal. Bella said no. She said she needed, people couldn't eat yet, she needed table linens in addition to the food. So the GIs got back into their Jeep and they liberated linens from another deserted house and brought them to Bella. She set the table with linens and cutlery and plates. She placed the food on the table in serving bowls and invited everyone to come to the table and dine with her. She made everyone wait, she said, because after nearly 6 years of being a prisoner, she wasn't about to eat like the savage the Nazis said she was. She refused their characterization. She sat down to this first meal in freedom as the dignified person she was. It is fitting to pay tribute to Bella, who stands as an inspiration and a model for all of us who live in freedom and for those of us who aspire to it. Thank you.
I wish I could have taken your class. That was so beautiful. I just know your class must have been marvelous. I do want to point out, we do have some faculty in the room who teach Holocaust-related topics and genocide studies, and if they would just raise their hands so that the audience can see this is one of the fields that we do teach. Your hand is not high enough, my dear. There we go. At all three campuses, we have courses that offer the ability to look at topics over time, and I would really have you take a look at those and consider those. And we do have an honors seminar right now that is meeting on Holocaust and genocide studies. I'm very pleased to be here and to be able to introduce our next speaker. Before I introduce her, I really have actually a message for the students in the classroom, because one of the things you're going to see is tonight we have a scholar who's very thoughtful. She's early in her career. She's very bright. She's got a lot of passion. She's very directed around her content area. And it's very impressive. And I need you to be impressed by what she's been able to do, the content area. But I really actually also want you to think about how on earth has she done so much in just 29 years? And I want you to think about what she has done to set herself up to do the kind of research that she's done, the kind of fellowships that she's had, the opportunity to do, is that she was part of the driver behind that. And when we get to the question and answers, I very much want you to ask about all the content that she's going to talk about. But I also want you to have the nerve to say, how on earth did you do this, and what lessons can I learn so that I can be like you, all right? Because there's a lot that's really cool there. Samantha Lakin is a PhD student at Clark University at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And Clark is in Massachusetts, if you don't know. Her main field site, her research rather, focuses on transitional justice in post-conflict societies. And I know there's more than one of you in the room that doesn't know what transitional justice is, but she promises she'll tell you what that is. Her main field site is Rwanda. She is most interested in questions of memorialization as a form of symbolic and social justice for survivors, focused on the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, and how memorial sites, spaces, and processes can help psychosocial healing for those who've experienced the gravest crimes. She has worked with the Transitional Justice Working Group at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard University. She's been a Raphael Lemkin Research Fellow with the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute, a policy officer with the Department of Research, Higher Education and Policy at the Aegis Trust in their Grant Genocide Research and Reconciliation Program. And she's been a researcher and technical assistant to the Genocide Archive of Rwanda and Peace Education Programs at the Kigali Genocide Memorial. She has also been a Fulbright Scholar, and her research grant took her to Switzerland, where she researched and conducted over 65 oral testimonies with Jewish child survivors of the Holocaust who had been rescued to Switzerland during World War II. She co-authored a book about that work with her photographer friend, Laura Bernier. Samantha holds a Master's of Art in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School, which is at Tufts University. She also holds a bachelor's degree from Brandeis University. As recently as 2008, she graduated college. So for those of you in the room, think about what she has done in so little time. And soon enough, her TED Talk, she was on the TEDx from Fulbright. She just did that at the end of September. The link is not yet published, but as soon as it is, we'll make sure that it gets to the Athenaeum Symposium site. And so I welcome this evening Samantha Lakin, PhD student and Fulbright Scholar.
Thank you for having me here. When I did my TED Talk about 2 weeks ago, I didn't come out and get to say, hi, thank you for having me here. I actually came out onto the stage got myself completely situated and in the mode and started telling a story about a Rwandan genocide survivor who was found in a hole in the ground covered with large dried banana leaves where she had been hiding for a month. So I didn't get to say, "Hi, how are you? It's good to see you." I just had to start with that because that was the impact that I was trying to make. So it's actually a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to see so many faces in the audience, both old and new friends, and I'm excited to speak to you today. Even though it's quite a grim subject, I think there'll be a lot to learn and a lot of lessons that we can take away about the world that we're living in today from these historical cases. So I wanted to share the first story with you. Basically, I remember in 2011, I was walking through the streets of Paris searching for an apartment in the 16th arrondissement. And I was looking for the home of a Holocaust survivor who I was to interview that day. And as I walked down the streets, I went through my pre-interview routine in my head. I have my camera, check. Informed consent form, check. Backup recorder, check. Interview questions, check. Don't cry, check. I found the apartment and was met by Rachel, who I was put in touch with through the OSE, the Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, which was an organization that worked to rescue children during the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, and who still works today supporting Holocaust survivors in France. The interview went well, and about 2 hours later, I was back in the elevator, leaving Rachel's apartment. And Rachel followed me out to the elevator and said something that I would never forget. "Samantha," she said, "I'm very happy I interviewed with you. I haven't told my story in a few years, and many people have recently asked to speak with me, and I've said no. But something compelled me to say yes to your interview, and I'm very happy I did. Thank you for the good work you are doing." I hugged Rachel, and I realized how I've never been thanked for any of the other jobs that I've had as much as I have while doing this work. I want you to travel with me to Rwanda, a small country in East Africa, about 5,000 miles away from Switzerland and from France. And in Rwanda is where the genocide against the Tutsi ravaged the country in 1994, leaving around 800,000 people dead in about 100 days. I first lived in Rwanda during the 19th commemoration period, which was from April to July 2013, where I was documenting survivors' testimonies about memory and justice. And the research heightened my awareness of communities who have experienced genocide and mass atrocities. Now, this is the first time I've actually been asked to speak about both my Fulbright experience and my Fulbright research with the Jewish Holocaust and survivors of the Jewish Holocaust, and with Rwanda. But I had written about it in the past because it's something that I often reflect on, as these two experiences have really struck me in terms of becoming a scholar on justice and memory. And my first instinct during that 19th commemoration was to speak to these students. I was speaking at Mount Kenya University in Kigali, was to tell them that, like Rwandans, Jews around the world live with the scars of the Holocaust. Now, I would argue that most Jews were educated about the brutality and genocidal madness that faced the Jewish people during the Holocaust, especially in their young years. And most high school and colleges and universities around the country and around the world have educational programs today, like the classes that many of you are taking. But what we have to realize is that soon we will no longer have survivors of the Holocaust to speak with, and we will only have memorial sites, memoirs, books, and recorded testimonies in order to understand the firsthand history of the Holocaust. And those of us who document these stories have to actually live with the burden to keep these stories and memories alive. As a Fulbright scholar, I had the privilege of performing research to uncover the history of Jewish children who were rescued to Switzerland during the Holocaust. Most of their parents were deported to concentration camps. The type of killing was widespread and systematic, covered by the United Nations definition of genocide. In my research, I explored Jewish and non-Jewish resistance to the Nazi final solution, specifically in France with Rescue to Switzerland. And many of these leaders of the resistance actually died when they were clandestinely combating the Nazi regime, which included rescuing children. I interviewed nearly 65 survivors of the Holocaust who had escaped to Switzerland and documented their experience. There were some common themes that presented themselves, including a loss of sense of childhood, disappeared and deported family and friends, having to hide their identity, sexual violence, interruption of education, fear of the unknown, of deportation, and of death. Some of these survivors I interviewed had never told their stories before, and others had spoken many times at commemorations, for school groups, and for their families. And my job was to get these individuals to say something different and to really trust me and understand that I knew their history and I had done my research so they could really open up and be in a safe space with me. And as I mentioned, in 2013, I'm kind of going to go back and forth a little bit. My research took me from Europe to Rwanda in 2013. And I remember during a visit to Agahozo Shalom Youth Village in Rwanda, which is a youth village where orphans of genocide live together and attend secondary school, high school together. And the village is based on actually a post-World War II model of community-based living in Israel. So basically there were these communities of Holocaust survivors in Israel that lived together and started to continue their education after they survived the Holocaust and came to Europe. And the Agahozo Shalom Youth Village was built upon that model of bringing these orphans together who had survived genocide and giving them the opportunity for communal living and education. So it was a very interesting, small connection there. And I actually met a boy there, a 20-year-old boy named Henry. And Henry had actually traveled with the Agahozo Shalom Youth Village to New York on a fundraising trip. Every year, the youth village brings a couple students to New York to do fundraising for the village. And this year, the students got to meet with Holocaust survivors. And as I sat in the cafeteria at the Agahozo Shalom Youth Village talking to Henry, I was immediately taken aback by his respect, by his confidence, yet his humility, and his ability to think big. And he told me about his visit with the Holocaust survivor in New York and how surprised he was by the similarities of their experiences. He was struck by the fact that the Nazis measured the Jewish noses, ears, facial features, something that was also done in Rwanda. He was also inspired by how the Holocaust survivor generation was focused on making the world a better place and working to ensure that the hate that they experienced was never repeated. He didn't know that there was a global movement of organizations and individuals dedicated to preventing future genocide and mass atrocities. His insight and understanding showed some of the similarities between the Holocaust and the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. And he really taught me a lot. The amazing thing I have to say is that Henry graduated from the Agahozo Shalom Youth Village last year and now has a full scholarship to McGill University in Canada. And because he's an orphan and has no parents, I'm actually responsible for him in many ways. And when I started working, I met him 2.5 years ago in a cafeteria in a youth village, and I never thought this relationship would grow. But to those of you who are students, he reached out to me and said, look, I need help writing my college applications, and I need help applying for scholarships, and I really think we can do this. And takes a lot of work, but I worked with him, and he's now a freshman at McGill, and basically I have a college-age child, even though I have no biological children. So it's a fascinating story of how knowing when to connect with people and how to try to reach your goals. I mean, he had ideas for fundraising that I didn't even come up with. So this is Henry. He's an incredible student, and it's beyond the work that I do as a researcher, but it's worth saying that if a student whose family lives on $29 a week can make it to McGill, you can make it anywhere you want. Today I want to discuss three main things. One is my Fulbright research, as I mentioned, about the rescue of Jewish children to Switzerland. The second is the preliminary findings of my PhD research, documenting local perspectives of justice in the aftermath of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. And the last is simply lessons learned. Where do we go from here? So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the specifics about my Fulbright research with Jewish children. And this is a photo that was taken by my colleague Laura Bernier, who was also a former Fulbright scholar in photography to Switzerland. And this is the barbed wire actually left over in 2011 from the border between France and Switzerland. So the border was covered with barbed wire. And actually, when we were there in 2011, we could still see remnants of the barbed wire at the border. So with the rise of anti-Semitism in 1933, which stemmed from the beginning of the Nazi regime in Germany, as many of you know, Jews began to face incredible hardships. And in light of the threat to the Jewish people, resistance began, resistance to the Nazi forces, and it manifested itself differently throughout World War II. Jews and non-Jews alike were involved in resistance movements, but there were also specifically Jewish networks of rescue and resistance, specifically under the auspices of the Armee Juive, or the Jewish army. And rescue as a form of resistance in Holocaust studies is a fairly new concept, but it's one that cannot be overlooked when thinking about the context of resistance to the Nazi forces. And so I'm going to discuss a little bit about who these children were, about how they arrived at the border, and actually how they lived in Switzerland, which was a story that I found had not really been looked into before. So the common belief among Jews in 1938 was that France would be a safe haven for Jewish children. France's official policy and had historically welcomed the Jewish community. And the belief in the day, you know, we have the benefit of hindsight where we can look back and say, oh, we could have seen that coming, we could have guessed that. But the belief in the day was that Germany would not invade France, which was another major world power. But Nazi forces occupied France in June of 1940, and the armistice between France and Germany was signed on June 22nd, 1940. And this changed the nature of many of the relief organizations operating in France. There was a huge beginning of roundups of Jews in 1942, specifically children and women, for deportation. And Jewish organizations like the one I mentioned before, the Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, the Zionist Jewish Youth Movement, and the Jewish Scouts realized that the homes they had set up for Jewish children in France were no longer safe. And they started to organize convoys to smuggle children to Switzerland. So it was very challenging to get these children to a border crossing point where they could even attempt to access Switzerland. Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant resistance organizations did have some access to transit camps in France, including ones like Rivesaltes and Gurs. And basically, they were able to send representatives into the transit camps to convince the parents to let their children out of the camps with a pass to go with these smugglers or these passeurs to cross the border. And you can imagine as a parent who's in a transit camp not knowing that they were going to be necessarily deported to a concentration camp, or hearing rumors but not being sure, to give up their child to a complete stranger who was dressed as a nurse or an aid worker was a very difficult decision, and a lot of parents did not allow their children to go. But many parents did allow their children to go, and they were able to be taken out of the transit camps. And they went basically so they could have a chance at safety in Switzerland. Children typically traveled in small groups between 6 and sometimes up to 15. And many children were sent back when they reached the border, which again was lined with barbed wire and a no man's land and another line of barbed wire. The passage occurred over mountains, over a period of days, which was often a traumatic experience for many refugees. Some cut themselves badly on the barbed wire. They didn't have shoes, or their shoes were too worn. Many children were separated from their families, and if they were saved in Switzerland, their families mostly died in the concentration camps. And if you can imagine, it was really difficult for the smugglers as well, because how do you disguise a group of 6 to 15 Jewish children, with their worn clothes, their worn shoes, looking ragged like refugees who needed a place to go. How did they disguise them and get them across the border? And the truth is, we can't speak with any of the border guards. Most of them are too old or deceased today, so we don't know what those individual decisions were in that moment when the border guards, especially the Swiss border guards, saw these convoys coming and turned a blind eye. And there were some communities in which the border guards were convinced by the mayor to turn a blind eye. But we don't know what they were thinking, and we probably never will. But some of them did, and some of these convoys did get into Switzerland. And this is a picture, actually, of a hiding place. So basically, this is a bridge, and there would be soldiers walking over the bridge, French soldiers, not Swiss soldiers. And basically, the children would hide in this hole and wait for the guards to take a break, and then they would run across the river, and there was a field across the way, and they would run across the field and cut through or climb through the barbed wire and be in the no man's land and then be in Switzerland. So they would hide here in this place for days, so this is the hiding place. So after having entered Switzerland, they were arrested by the border guards, and refugees were taken to guard posts to be questioned. And although some spent the first few days in prison, many were taken directly to installations known as Camp d'accueil, which is actually a false translation. It should mean welcome camps, but it actually means reception camps. They were not quite welcomed there. And the refugees were confined to these reception camps for an undetermined period of time, sometimes a few days to a few weeks, while awaiting a permanent placement. They were organized by the Federal Department of Justice and Police in Switzerland, and the reception camps were set in various types of structures, family homes, hotels, factories, military barracks. And while in reception camps, Jewish children experienced mixed feelings of relief, anxiety, and uncertainty. They were out of the direct danger of deportation and death, and they had their basic needs met. And after months of concealing their identities, they really could finally speak openly about who they were. Some of them even reunited with friends and family from home, or found people with whom they could speak by common origin, country origin, or language. But at the same time, many were scared because they lacked information about where their family members were, and they actually feared for their safety while awaiting permanent placement. They thought they might be expelled from Switzerland. The refugees' children were eventually assigned a placement, either with a foster family or an institution. And this is an example of the booklet that they were given, where all of their movement and their rations were tracked, this blue booklet. And many child survivors who I interviewed recalled their experiences of living, especially with Swiss families. Some had good experiences, some were completely alienated. So, the myth is, why are we talking about Switzerland, right? Everybody survived, everybody had a good life. But the truth of the matter is, I truly believe that there's no hierarchy of pain, and there's no hierarchy of suffering, of experience. And for a long time, these rescued children felt that they had no place to speak because they weren't concentration camp survivors, so their suffering just wasn't worth it. It just wasn't as bad. And when I spoke to them, a lot of them felt liberated because they said, look, no one's asked us because we don't feel that we're as much of survivors as the concentration camp survivors are. So the experience of speaking with these survivors is that they survived, and they can tell us what happened, but they really experienced a lot of trauma, incredible loss, and they are a big piece to this story. So, I also wanted to show you this picture of Aviva, and she actually has photos from the children's home she was in. She was in a Jewish-based children's home, which is basically an orphanage, and it was sponsored by a religious organization from Israel, then Palestine. And you can see she's kind of remembering these moments in this home. So I think the institutional settings were generally much better than foster families because people were in communities. So reflecting on the realities of the wartime situation, living in the children's homes was far from luxurious. Meals provided little more than sustenance, heat and hot water were limited. But those who cared for the homes were generally professional educators and really trying to help the physical, psychological, and educational needs of the children. And again, those who stayed in Switzerland mostly survived the war and were able to immigrate to the United States or Israel or go back to their home country in Europe. And again, their feelings about how they were treated in Switzerland really vary based on each individual situation. But once they were safe in Switzerland, they had a real chance to survive. And this rescue in Switzerland turned into a pretty major operation that saved generations of Jewish people. So I'd like to take you now 5,000 miles, 9,000 kilometers, to a discussion of my PhD research, which documents local perspectives of justice in the aftermath of genocide. And many of you may think, how did you get from the Jewish Holocaust to this small East African country? And the answer is transitional justice. So transitional justice is a field that I discovered after most of you probably. Those of you who are taking transitional justice now are in the know way before I was. And basically I got to my master's program, which was based on modern day conflicts, and I was this like history person and I didn't fit in. And I spoke to one of my professors and she said, you do fit in. You fit in with transitional justice. You want to look at communities and countries that are coming out of conflict and crisis and how to provide justice for those survivors and others who experienced these horrible atrocities. And you want to do that by talking to people and documenting their experiences and relaying it to policymakers and people who make decisions. And I said, yes, that's what I want to do. So I thank that professor very much because she introduced me to the field of transitional justice. And while I was in my master's program, I got the opportunity to travel to Rwanda and start working there. So again, after my Fulbright experience, I realized that what I loved the most was documenting stories of survivors and understanding how these untold stories were meant to discover a history that's not widely known. And after pursuing and receiving a position in Rwanda, I decided to pursue my PhD at the Strassler Center at Clark and to focus my dissertation on interviews with local Rwandans about their attitudes towards symbolic justice. So not court cases, but symbolic forms of justice, public apologies, memorial sites, commemorations, that provide a validation for people who have experienced these grave crimes. I've been to Rwanda 5 times in the past 2.5 years, the longest for 3 months and the shortest for 1 month. And like my Fulbright work, I found it really important to document these untold stories and perspectives on justice in Rwanda as told by those local individuals. This is just one last photo of the interview table. So this is kind of what our interviews looked like in Switzerland. So during the genocide in Rwanda, just to provide some background, approximately 800,000 civilians were massacred, both Tutsi and moderate Hutus, consisting as much as 20% of the country's total population and 70% of the Tutsis who were the targeted persecuted group who were living in Rwanda at the time, 70% of that group. Perpetrators belonged to the Rwandan army, the national police, government-backed militias, including the Interahamwe, and Hutu civilian populations. And much of this is due to Belgian colonial influence, which again was highly shaped by European obsessions with race relations, including creation of superior races. And this is when Hutu and Tutsi ethnicity in Rwanda became salient and divided. So Hutu and Tutsi ethnicity in Rwanda, just to completely debunk a myth, they're not tribes, and it wasn't a case of tribal hatred. Hutu and Tutsi didn't mean very much before the colonialists came to Rwanda. And people could even switch. It was a class system. Wealthier kingship classes were Tutsi and kind of farmers were Hutu. And you could even switch classes if you became a pastoralist or became a farmer. But with the introduction of this race ideology, Hutu and Tutsi started to mean something. And that's when the Hutus felt they were basically being, this is very brief history, being oppressed and started the Hutu power movement, which has to do with much more than a tribal hatred or an ethnic hatred. And you can read a lot more about that in your classes, and I can give you some recommendations. But basically, Fast forwarding, I'm not going to talk specifically about the genocide, but you can imagine what some of the horrors were. Maybe you've seen movies, you've seen films on PBS, Frontline, there's a great documentary. But it was bad. It was really, really bad. And in Rwanda, since the genocide, since 1994, there has been a strong focus on symbolic reparations as a form of transitional justice. And this has been to aid the psychosocial healing for survivors, especially through the construction of memorial sites. And memorialization is a weird word, and it's a word you might not have heard of, but it's a process that basically satisfies the desire to honor those who suffered or died during the conflict, and a way to examine the past history of what happened during the genocide. Memorialization aims to promote social recovery after violent conflict, but sometimes can reinforce senses of victimization, discrimination, and desires for revenge. And the process of memorialization is different in every case. So you've got kind of the positive theory of memorialization and the negative theory. And my research is actually to speak to local individuals to figure out, is this theory matching with the lived experiences of what people are asking for justice? Is what they're asking for beyond courts, which have closed now in many cases, the Gacaca courts and the ICTR have closed, what are people asking for, and what would give them a sense of justice? So I'm actually asking them those questions and trying to understand how it relates to the theory or the theorized benefits and challenges of symbolic justice. So basically, memorials can affect and shape the discourse surrounding larger issues of rebuilding and reconciliation. And as time passes and quality research is performed, memorial sites can potentially have greater effects. Rwanda is a case where there's heavy memorialization. When you drive down the street, you can see a memorial in every town, in every commune, in every village. And there are also 6 national memorial sites which are upkept. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of what the memorial sites are like. The memorial sites are my main research sites, so I spend a lot of time doing direct observation, speaking with people who work there, and trying to understand who visits, for what purposes, and what benefits are they seeing, or what challenges are they seeing there. So this is the Kigali Genocide Memorial, which is also called Gisozi. And this is the most visited memorial by international visitors and local visitors. And basically, it has a full educational exhibit, Genocide Archive of Rwanda, and many things. But this is a unique memorial because it's probably the most developed and the most close to like a Western memorial that we've seen, like the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. It's not nearly as big or extensive, but it has this idea of educating through a permanent exhibit. This is Ntarama Memorial Church, and basically Ntarama Memorial Church is a church where individuals were massacred in the church. So Tutsi actually sought refuge in the church, and the Interahamwe and police militia were able to go into the church and actually kill people. And these are clothes of victims hanging from the rafters. So these memorial churches are very different than the Kigali Genocide Memorial. They don't have educational exhibits. They are just the raw, sheer facts of the genocide basically being displayed and shown. They also show human remains like skulls and bones, which I didn't put in the photos today. So the Nyamata Memorial Church is close to Ntarama, located in the Bugesera region. And you can see the mass graves there. So there are basically people buried underneath, clothes on the pews. You know, it's just a very raw, shocking place. The churches are original, as are the clothes and the human remains. And this is Nyarabuye, where you can see the mass graves outside, which are really well taken care of. And what's amazing is the church where people were massacred is still a functioning church today. So people are still gathering at the church every Sunday. Actually, I have a story. One of my friends and I, my friend who's a filmmaker, went to Nyarabuye to interview people, and we decided to go on a Sunday, which ended up being a great idea because we caught people as they were leaving church. And literally, the church is located right in front of this memorial site. The site of massacre is now the site of worship today. And we were able to basically through a local contact, speak to people who were just leaving church and say, what's your experience with this place? Why did you decide to come back to this place? And it was really interesting seeing the fact that this community was up and running again today in a mixed community of different groups of people in the same place that was a massacre site 21 years ago. So very interesting dichotomy. So survivors especially remind us that memory helps mourn and honor the dead, and this is really important to Rwandan survivors especially. Being able to find victims' bodies, to bury them respectfully, whether at home or in memorial sites, is incredibly important. And this, again, provides a sense of dignity and validation, which is, in course, related to justice. And even those who have not found their loved ones after 21 years are generally say, I know that they may be in this area, or they may be in this region, or they may already have been buried when 50 others were buried. So they have some sense of satisfaction and closure. But without the closure, feeling that sense of justice can be really difficult, which is something I've heard through my interviews. And basically, many genocide victims were buried hastily in mass graves or were not buried at all. And this respectful burial process that happens in memorial spaces is essentially important in allowing survivors to feel a peace of mind about their loved one's final resting place. It also provides a concrete space to mourn. Some people say they don't need to go to the memorial site because they remember and they mourn every day. And others say, look, I want to go on with my life and I want to push it aside, but when the date of their death, the anniversary of their death comes, I want a space to be able to mourn, and I want a community to be able to mourn with. And the genocide in Rwanda affected nearly every individual, and so it's not hard to find a community to mourn with, but you kind of have two groups of people or two ideas. One is, I remember every day and I don't need a site to remind me, and the other is, I really want to move on with my life, educate my children, and when I want to remember, the site is there for me. Education is also created at the memorial sites with the raw history and the facts present, the original massacre sites. Every one of the memorial sites is basically a mass grave or massacre site, with the exception of the Kigali Genocide Memorial, which serves as a mass grave for 259,000 victims from the area of Kigali. So it wasn't specifically a massacre site, but bones were collected and bodies from around the area. And seeing these human remains enclosed often causes a very visceral and physical reaction to those who witness this, in addition to an emotional one. And therefore, memorials must also be symbolically meaning and not just shocking, which is, I think, a place for improvement. So just to conclude, you may be asking yourself, how does a young woman from New Jersey become involved in this type of work? And for me, documenting stories of survivors of mass atrocities and genocide was really something I never imagined myself doing as a young girl. Probably most of you can imagine that. I always wanted to help people, but I didn't realize until I was much older how quality research and listening to local voices can truly impact policy and programs to aid some of the most vulnerable people. And working with victims, survivors, perpetrators, bystanders is not easy. And to be honest, many people can't do it. They turn to self-abusive behavior when working in these intense situations. They cannot sustain this type of work. They ruin their relationships, they drink, they use drugs, and they burn out. And for me, I've learned to find a balance when researching this genocide and hearing these difficult things. And I don't think it's because I'm any better than anyone else. I just think it's because it's different. You know, there were things that I'm not meant to do, and there are things I am meant to do. And when I realized this was working for me after 6+ years of this kind of work, I said, let's go for it. And I wanted to stick to it because I think we need good people in this area. And I'm going to now recruit those of you who are taking these classes, because we really need good people, whether they're policy people, whether they're social services, psychologists, social workers, care, health workers, anything. We need people in this area. So let me provide some examples of my additional work in this area that are potentially inspiring examples of what two organizations in specific have actually done to assist survivors and others who have experienced genocide. And I serve on the board of trustees of both of these organizations. And the reason I serve these organizations is because I am continually impressed by the work that they do. Every time I meet with their executive director, every time I see the beneficiaries in the programs, I am truly impressed by the caliber and the ability to do this work well and to not do any harm. And that's one of the reasons why I really am dedicated to serving these organizations above and beyond, potentially some capacity some days. So one is the Genocide Survivors Support Network, which is based in New Jersey, and actually the executive director has just moved to Baltimore, for those of you who want to potentially become involved or meet her. She was supposed to be here tonight, but we were at a wedding this weekend, and we were all very exhausted, so she just got home to Baltimore today. So the Genocide Survivors Support Network is dedicated to supporting survivors of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi who currently live in the United States. And the Genocide Survivors Support Network, it tries to help survivors rebuild their lives by using their voice to contribute to genocide prevention through education and advocacy. And to achieve these goals, the GSSN works with, to connect survivors with mental health services, immigration services, community integration services, education and development opportunities. And one of the amazing things, sorry, that's the Genocide Survivors Support Network. One of the amazing things is last year in 2014, we hosted the first ever Survivors Voice program, where we brought 40 Rwandan genocide survivors to Harvard Law School from over like 10 states to attend the first ever training on how to use their stories and testimonies for educational purposes. And we plan to do more of these programs in the future. They're especially important because in addition to legal services and financial literacy, which really stays underground, and we can't speak that much about our work with that, these kinds of programs equip speakers and survivors to go into schools, into colleges and universities, so it's not the same person every time, and really equips them to tell their story, to work with students, to work with community members, and especially around commemoration days, and engage in education. So it's both a great experience for the survivors themselves, but also for the communities in which they live. The second organization is Survivors Fund, which is a UK-based NGO, also known on the ground as SURF. And SURF sponsors holistic programs developed and led by survivors, including the Associations of Widows of the Genocide, AVEGA, and the Students Association of Survivors, IERJ. And SURF provides technical support to these survivor-led programs. The programs range from healthcare to housing, education, entrepreneurship. They do a lot of livelihoods programs as well, and health. And SURF is one of the most serious organizations dedicated to providing psychological services to genocide survivors in Rwanda. Every one of their programs includes psychological counseling and psychological services in addition to whatever the program is. And psychological care is still incredibly rare in Rwanda. So the fact that SURF is providing these additional psychological services in a meaningful and impactful way is really incredible. And every day, I become more and more impressed with the work of Genocide Survivors Support Network and of Survivors Fund. So two good things to learn about. So I'm going to conclude by saying that we cannot reverse the tragedies of the past, but we can consider how these lessons can change our actions regarding future prevention and education. Going back to Mount Kenya University's 19th commemoration in 2013, I challenged the students to make themselves stronger leaders for the future. One Rwandan survivor there told me that to know sorrow and difficulty makes an individual stronger. That when you feel the pain of others, you can also feel the joy and the love more strongly. We cannot erase the past. We can, however, leave today committed to educating ourselves about the injustices in the world and leave today with a heightened awareness and stronger commitment to what we can do to repair the world. If each of us does our small part, we will be able to create a significant change. I want to conclude there, and I welcome any questions. So thank you so much for having me. You're an incredible audience, and I hope you learned something.
I just wanted to congratulate you for the work you're doing, and part of what you were saying reminded me that we have child survivors today of situations where there are children who are refugees who are being sent up from situations in Central America, and also the refugees that are seeking places in Europe. And I just wanted to see if you could comment on the current situations.
Sure. Thank you. So the question was about those who are refugees from conflict areas today, both in Central America, but also those coming from Syria seeking refuge in Europe. You know, I get asked this question a lot because we're expected to know something about what's going on today, even as a historian. And the thing I think is that we truly should not forget the lessons of the past. The news is saying this is the worst refugee crisis since World War II. And in World War II, we know that there were meetings and agendas where quotas were put on how many Jews could enter a certain country. And it was very rare that a country would take Jews. And many countries closed their doors, and we know what happened. And I think that many people don't look to the past today to see what happened and the dangers. And especially in Europe, you know, the first point of entry for many refugees is Greece and Hungary, who are also countries in crisis, and Hungary has a particularly right-wing government. But places like Germany are actually rejecting the Dublin Accords, which the Dublin Accords say that the refugees have to register at their first point of entry. And Germany is saying, well, the first point of entry won't register these people to give them services. So if they make it to us, even though we're not their first point of entry, we are going to register them and allow them to get the services that they deserve as registered refugees. Which is an amazing breakthrough to say, look, we're breaking international normative protocol because we want to help people. So I think it's creative solutions like that that are really going to be a game changer. Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan are taking a ton of refugees and are really taking the brunt of it from Syria. European states are taking people, but if you look at Arab states, they're not taking anyone. If you look at UK and US, barely taking anybody. So I think that the capacity is there, but the world needs to be working together. Thank you for your question.
First of all, I want to say thank you for the amazing work you're doing, because especially during the Holocaust or this horrible genocide event, should be given the chance for these people to have a voice. So that's fantastic to have. And also, now that you see all this cruelty from the Syrian, that you see these kids drowning just to survive, and people getting harmed and hurt just to try to keep their family alive or just to survive this horribleness and human cruelty, did it affect you, this cruelty, at all?
Yeah, the question is, you know, witnessing today's cruelties, especially what's happening in Syria and other refugees. I mean, there are also refugees coming from Northern Africa trying to cross to Israel and into Europe and Middle East. I remember the day that the infamous photo of the 4-year-old boy, the Kurdish boy, came out, the one who had drowned, you know, face down. And people called me and said, did you see this? What happened? I mean, of course I saw it. Did you see this? What do you think? And I was speechless for about 3 days. I could not say or reflect at all. Because when you work in your domain, you know, in your field, you kind of learn how to desensitize yourself. Like those things I was talking about in the beginning, I actually go through that protocol and say, look, that interview is a job, it's a profession. And when I go home and rewatch the interviews, I cry. But when I'm there, I can't. Because I need to be strong for that person that I'm speaking with, and I need to be comforting for them. But for 3 days, I couldn't call anyone back and tell them what I thought. I mean, seeing that today, and I teach about it. I TA a visualizing human rights course, and we did a session on refugees. And it was very hard for me to bring balanced information to the students because I'm still affected by it. And I'm overwhelmed every day by how much we can't do, even if we try. But the truth of the matter is I then look at my Facebook news feed and see what my friends are doing, and I'm proud of them. And every little bit that they're doing makes me feel like I can do it better. So, mixed bag.
Thank you very much for your presentations, very enlightening, and to see the unfortunate effects of genocide all over the world. If we look at the world right now, it seems that the Muslims are being on the brink of a genocide at various countries. So what is the environment that existed before a genocide occurred? And where in the world are these areas, according to your research? Mm-hmm. And what areas are ripe, unfortunately, for a future genocide?
So it's a great question. You know, what areas are ripe for future genocide and what should we be watching for? And I'll mention the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum just launched an early warning project that has statistical analysis about some of these countries to watch. My specialization is Africa, specifically East Africa, so that's what I know best. Looking at countries like Burundi with election violence, Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, CAR, Central African Republic, remnants of the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, in these places, Sudanese, the SPLA. I mean, a lot of conflict from clandestine groups. Will it be genocide? That's a legal question, but it's also a sociological and historical question. I think the legal definition of genocide is very limiting, so it's going to depend on more so how we interpret the actions. And unfortunately, it's when the violence breaks out that we really pay attention. And you're right, we need to be looking for early warning symbols. Some people in the theory point to authoritarian governments, point to secession, states that want secession, minority persecution. These are things that people say to watch out for. I mean, post-colonialism was a mess for most of these African countries. And to speak about Muslim communities, I mean, unfortunately, all three major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are being hijacked by extremists. And we know, those of us who understand the religions, that these are at heart peaceful religions, all of them. And it's the extremists who hijack it that are ruining it for everyone, in my opinion. That's my personal opinion. So none of those religions are particularly hateful, but they all have people who are representing it that way. And it's a shame for the rest of us who believe in the peace.
Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned something I'm not acquainted with because I haven't studied the area. What is the UN definition of genocide, and what would your definition of genocide be?
Thank you. That's a great question. So the question is, what is the United Nations definition of genocide, and what would my definition be? So this is going to take me another 3.5 years to figure out because my PhD is based in genocide theory. But the United Nations in 1948 ratified the Convention for the Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Prevention and Punishment for the Crime of Genocide. Basically, we're looking at destruction of a group in whole or in part based on a number of categories, religion, ethnicity. There's a couple other categories. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering them now. I actually should have written them down. But basically, political categories is not one of them. So because of what was happening at the time, because the Soviet Union and other countries would not have ratified a convention that put cultural or political groups in the category of these persecuted groups for genocide. So that's where I feel it falls short. There are terms like politicide, femicide, democide. I mean, other terms that have been used to kind of compensate for that. But I think when it's an intent to destroy in whole or in part. An intent is that hard part in the legal definition. How do you show the intent to destroy? In the Nazi cases, there were documents. In Rwanda, nothing but lists on pieces of, like, basically Post-its. You know, the intent is very difficult. So for me, I think that a broader sociological definition would be looking at groups that are truly persecuted and targeted for who they are, if that group can be defined as a unit in itself, as a group that both the outside sees as a group and they see themselves as a group. Yes, one more. Oh.
Hello? All right. Sorry.
Hi.
I guess I was going to say, what role did language had to play, basically, between with the situation in, like, Europe, basically compared to the Jewish Holocaust and that of Rwanda, basically, and you can maybe, like, touch on that and continue on that, basically. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So the question was just about some further comparisons between the Jewish Holocaust and what happened in Rwanda, the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. And I think that comparisons are to be made, but only hold so far. Some of the comparisons, I would say, are the ideology that was present. So the ideology, you know, in the Nazi regime that Jews were foreigners, that Jews were intruders, that Jews were an invasive species, that Jews were dehumanized, Jews were less than, they weren't citizens, and they were basically ruining this idea of creating like a pure Aryan state. That also happened in Rwanda. Tutsi were considered subhuman. They were also dehumanized, called cockroaches, rats, things like that. They were also seen as invasive. They were intruders trying to take Hutu land, take Hutu power, take back the country, and they didn't belong there. So those kinds of rhetoric and propaganda that took place in addition to the ideology and dehumanization was very similar. However, the patterns and the methods of killings were different. You have a very kind of what we call high-tech situation in the Jewish Holocaust with factories of killing, you know, concentration camps, these trains, I mean, all of that. In Rwanda, you have what we call a low-tech type of killing, people just going from village to village with machetes, rounding people up and kind of killing right in the middle of communities, seeking people out of their homes, out of hiding places. So the models and patterns of killings are different.
Again, thank you for your presentation. As an elder, it gives me great solace that one of your generation still holds on to so many of those things that my generation thought we had that could change the world. I want to ask you about in Rwanda now, what is the atmosphere? What's the tenor of the times? Are the memorial sites working? Is there a sense of closure that the people are feeling? You've got Hutus and Tutsis, I guess, working in hotels together. What do you feel when you're in the midst?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think everyone heard, but it's, what does it feel like in Rwanda now? What's happening in terms of, I guess, reconciliation and people together? I think closure is not there. You have survivors who are still seeking things. You have elderly survivors, you have widows, disabled survivors, survivors with HIV and AIDS, children born of rape who are not considered survivors legally. So there are a lot of issues that people are still looking for government and other communities to assist them. You also have a majority Hutu community, again, about 80% Hutu, 15% Tutsi, like we did before the genocide, similar numbers, and a minority government. The government is majority Tutsi with Hutu also in the government, but it is stemming from the Rwandan Patriotic Front and Army, which was a Tutsi-based liberation movement. So that government has to keep everyone happy. And it's difficult, but people need each other, just like they did before the genocide. And economically, things are working well. And health and education-wise, the country's incredible. I mean, the streets, the buildings in the cities, I mean, the first skyscrapers we see in Africa, I mean, pretty incredible stuff. Roads, paved roads, yeah, it's amazing. But at the same time, I think when you dig a little bit deeper, there are still people who are longing for something and saying, look, after 21 years, you may think we're fine, but we're still not. It's still pretty young.